Sometimes the nature of something takes years of introspection and observation to reveal itself. Sometimes only time itself is the means by which further evidence can be gathered and subsequently conclusions drawn. And when it comes to human nature, above all, male nature, as well as the revelations that MGTOW-related thought has brought about, as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither can the evolution of thought be consigned to some irretrievable epoch, never to be touched upon again. And thus, it is with this inevitable evolution of thought that I present my cumulative ruminations upon a difficult subject matter, namely MGTOW, the red pill, human nature, and the potential pitfalls that seem to arise when digesting all these elements over a longer, sustained period of time. Some people won't be happy with this, but then again, I cannot recall a single instance in which something I said pleased the many. So with that said, I shall begin. Years ago, when MGTOW on YouTube was in its nascent stages, we began to plot out a diagram of human nature, specifically the nature of the sexes, how men and women interact, and the specifics of the dynamics pertaining thereto. The motivation behind this was simple. We sought to unravel what had hitherto been a mystery perpetuated by the core elements of our very nature, and a society running on those elements. The biological turned social, as we in time ascertained that all that is social must necessarily have its roots in the biological, a reflection of drives, imperatives, and desires that hark back millions of years, made manifest in something we called civilization, and in more common parlance, society. It was a time of great thirst, throats parched for want of knowledge of an apparently laming condition we had been endowed with, and so we took it upon ourselves to chart this strange constellation. Why did we as men behave the way we did? And perhaps, more importantly, why did women act the way they did? The mystery, it turned out, was no mystery at all, and neither was it rocket science. To understand the very basics took minuscule effort and little knowledge, and to delve deeper and go beyond the basics took somewhat more, but such things remained largely accessible, and thereupon we found ourselves courting the ears of thousands of men, which served in part as a testament to the universality of the discoveries and claims made, as men across the world, in learning of these things, found concordance therewith in their own lives. Too many, it seemed, to be a mere coincidence. We had peeled back the layers of a mystery that had been no mystery at all. But after all that peeling, certain things crystallized in our minds, and our lives were, in different ways, changed forever. I am, of course, talking about the consumption of the red pill. These days, the red pill has come to mean anything and everything. But in those days, it did in fact refer to the knowledge of female and male nature and the interaction between the two. Generally speaking, when man embarks upon a new path of discovery, it is done with two things that go along with it. The first thing is the relative ignorance and or indifference to the potential consequences of said discovery. And the second thing is a sort of boundless optimism, the belief that in discovering certain things and understanding them, we can improve ourselves and others. And I think that MGTOW in its earlier days was very much a case study of this phenomenon. What I am implying, and indeed saying, is that there are and will always be unintended consequences that accompany any discovery and any exposition and exploration of the fruits of such discovery. Thus, the focus of this video is the elements of the red pill, human nature, and MGTOW that have never been properly addressed, which do not lead to positive outcomes. Knowledge is always a double-edged sword, and it can both harm and help, and sometimes the same knowledge, the same facts, the same information can lead to vastly different outcomes for individuals, and MGTOW and the associated pool of knowledge and concepts is no exception to this. I have, due to the preponderance of evidence presented to me over time, come to the conclusion that, depending on the context, the red pill is not for every man, specifically not on the individual level. I should be clear that there are two levels that are operative here, the micro and the macro, and they need to be discussed separately. But before we come to the micro and macro effects, let us first tackle the general assumption that red pilling a man is necessarily a liberation, i.e., take the red pill and be free. Many, many moons ago, I put out a video about the male desire for unfreedom. What I did not, however, go into any depth on in that video was whence this desire for unfreedom arises. Why does it seem that so many men are resistant to the so-called red pill and the knowledge contained therein? It is not merely a matter of denying the less than appealing aspects of female reproductive nature and behavior, though that is certainly an aspect. Even the toughest of men might initially feel hard-pressed to accept the fact that his spouse or partner views him merely in terms of resource provision and status, with little to none of the humanity she normally accords to her children or blood relatives. That certainly is to many men unwelcome news, but it is not the real issue at hand, as many men simply come to accept that aspect of things in time. The real issue is another one, involving an inextricable link between reproductive desire and the action and will to follow through on derivative behaviors once the red pill has been fully digested. As I had mentioned prior, knowledge is at best a tool, or more aptly, a state of the world that exists independent of man, and giving a man the red pill can affect him in myriad ways. For some, the red pill is indeed liberation, a freedom from shackles formerly hated, but unmitigated freedom is not without its own pitfalls. I can certainly speak for myself, and to a lesser degree for others with whom I have spoken over the years, that no longer having to plod along on the treadmill of traditional dictates was partially liberating, though in my own case I must confess that I had in fact only partially trod upon it. I had never wished for marriage, and had always been undecided on the matter of offspring, and even after that, for the longest time, I had been thoroughly purple-pilled. For years, in fact, deeply skeptical about female nature and the claims people made about women that never seemed to be able to be mapped out onto reality, yet still, to varying degrees in the dark, not fully aware. The red pill, for me, thus crystallized most of my suspicions in far greater detail than I could have ever known. The subsequent reading and delving into an extensive body of literature on evolution and evolutionary psychology rendered firm a body of knowledge that I now in my advanced years take for granted. The red pill empowered me to commit far less to things to which I had previously only been weakly committed to begin with, namely the reproductively driven treadmill and all the things associated with it. Over time, the vast majority of my ambitions faded away as I understood that they had been born of something I no longer had the desire to pursue. Indeed, even many of my normal interests have faded away in subsequent years. And effectively, this is what this video sets out to treat: the effects that the red pill and MGTOW-related thought can have on certain individuals on the micro level, as opposed to the macro level. Over the years, I have received hundreds of private messages from men who, after consumption of the red pill, sought answers from me in the hopes of discovering where their motivation had gone, and why they had lost their desire to pursue things that formerly held their interest, save for the bare minimal to survive. Routine, too, and typical of such correspondences were statements such as, "I used to work so hard at this hobby, or this thing, or another, but now I barely feel like doing anything. What has happened to me?" I've also had many similar Skype calls with such men looking for answers to questions that had plagued them, and why they, almost on a subconscious level, appeared to have been changed irrevocably. Where had their ambition gone? Why had they become so listless? Part of this I had addressed in a now ancient video called The Red Pill Malaise. However, the video did not really go into the necessary detail. For many men, including myself, the chain of reproductively motivated behavior is part of a package deal, or better put, is symbiotic in nature. If a man cuts himself off from one element, particularly a crucial element of reproductively driven behavior, such as dating, the attendant consequences can be manifold, despite the source of the consequences itself being singular. Or one can look at reproductively motivated behavior in the sense of architecture. If you remove a buttress that is part of a greater structure, the whole structure can and will collapse. For many of us, there's little rage that comes with the red pill, and far more an apathy. I can plainly state for myself and others of similar bent that have confided in me that I have virtually no interest in women, apart from being an occasional source of arousal. Frankly speaking, they bore me to death, and whilst many reproductively motivated MGTOW still find them compelling enough to spend copious amounts of time on them both in words and deeds, they have little to offer me. How did this come about? Rather easily, I would say. In understanding the reproductive dynamics at play to a greater depth than most, and to a far greater depth than I had in previous times, I had to ask myself why I ought to pursue something that is, in the best case scenario, trite, and in the worst case scenario, a waste of time and money, and potentially far worse. However, little did I realize that in the attenuation of interest in female kind, that there would also be an attenuation of virtually everything that goes along with it, with much of what I had done in the past revealing itself to have been grounded in base reproductive desires. For example, religiously attending the gym, or attempting to look my best. And this is what I mean by part of a package deal. In fully consuming the red pill, the ultimate result for some, and perhaps many, is not rage, since rage implies a cognitive dissonance, but what I might call the lazy lion effect. What is the lazy lion effect? It is both a real-world example, as well as a metaphor, of the lion, once sated, who does not spend excess time or energy on things that are not essential to his survival. The many men I have communicated with over the years all seem to have been affected by this, which leads me to believe that, even if it is not universal, it is common enough to be a consequence and symptom of effectively being quote-unquote too red-pilled. In essence, the desire to achieve, to push oneself to one's limits, is as a rule a distal derivative of basic reproductive dynamics, and cutting oneself off from it can leave oneself in a difficult spot. I should observe that there are exceptions to this, but I do not think these exceptions constitute the rule. Young men in their 20s, particularly mid and early 20s, are still very much in the prime of their hormones, and feel compelled towards male-female interaction to a far greater degree than someone in his 40s. I recall a specific example of this from several months ago. A young fellow who had spent months absorbing MGTOW content and red pill material, observing how continuously it lined up and fitted his real-life experience, and feeling a sense of dread and despair at this, not anger by any means, which would eventually lead him to apathy. We spoke for several hours on the phone, and I sadly could not tell him that it would get any better, or that it would improve. Indeed, in typical Stardust fashion, I told him that it would likely get worse. After this exchange, to the best of my knowledge, with him in his early 20s, he was able to take advantage of his hormonal state to propel him onwards. But what I'm ultimately curious about is how long that will last. More recently, I was speaking with a close friend, who in many ways is the opposite of me in every conceivable way, who confided in me that his work ethic and continuation of past actions, after he'd cut himself off from the desire to associate with women, at least directly, was a consequence of obsessive-compulsive behavior that forced him to work day in and day out without pause, as even when he attempted to stop and take a break, hardly a day would pass, and he would feel compelled by what is effectively a neurosis to continue his work, yet all the while feeling little to no pleasure in it, despite accumulating money and growing his business substantially. He continues to work, but the lack of pleasure in that work is almost certainly a consequence of an exceptionally heavy dose of red pills. And a man can believe in a fictional narrative, or elsewise be driven by some other instinct as well. I fully concede that. Coltane, for example, in recent months has taken to fasting twice a week for more than 24 hours each time, because his mortality salience compelled him to do so. But even in this case, this is just a part of basic human wiring, and there are plenty of people, myself included, who lack that self-same mortality salience, and consequently a similar drive to execute such actions. And thus, as I had intimated earlier, MGTOW and the red pill on a micro level, for the individual man, is not always the best thing, if considerations of productivity and ambition are given highest priority. I can say with hindsight that I would have been a far more productive and ambitious individual if I had remained in a perpetually purple-pilled state. However, it is also a virtual certainty that a perpetually purple-pilled state would have eluded me, because I am, by my very nature, exceptionally curious, and I wish to understand things. At some point in time, sooner or later, a change of hues as pertains to the world would have occurred. And, if I am honest, that is the only thing that seems to motivate me to do anything these days, the desire to understand. That, however, does not necessarily make me as productive as I could be, and it certainly does not make me happy. But then again, I've never been a particularly happy individual. So one could say that this was simply not in the cards for me regardless. But after all is said and done, all that remains is a simple desire to understand, heedless of the consequences. That option, it should be noted, is not for every man, and most of the men I've mentioned and communicated with have found no solace in such an endeavor, though I wouldn't call it solace in my case either, that merely being an extension of my own being as an individual, and hence in such cases, it might very well be devoutly wished to return to the benighted state of yore, and who frankly can blame such men? And many indeed have expressed this desire to me to return to nescience. I cannot begrudge them that, as I fully understand, and indeed oftentimes feel as they do. But for us, there is no return to the matrix. There is no cipher's path. The past is done, and all that we were is largely gone. I offer all of this as a cautionary tale, that MGTOW, the red pill, and the associated elements are not something to be carelessly heaped upon the masses of men, because everything that is revealed, inasmuch as it is true, and can be highly consequential, is not always for the good, at least on a micro level. Some of these men will ultimately lose their lives in a process brought about by this red pilling, and perhaps they are, as I have been to a lesser degree, merely casualties in something bigger than they themselves are, or ever could be. This is why I remain to this day deeply skeptical of the mass marketing approach to MGTOW that so many seem enamored of. Do they have the best interests of those they superficially expose to MGTOW ideas at heart? I highly doubt it, but I leave them be. I can only offer consideration, after all, and reflection on my own work and path. I should, of course, as a matter of fact, point out that many of these men have also been spared particularly horrid divorces and personal privations that likely would have occurred had they not been exposed to the red pill. But then, it becomes a question of simple trade-offs. One loses one thing and retains the other. But the real question is, which thing is the more valuable? And I think that the answer to that question will lie in the individual man. That answer is not mine to give. There are almost certainly men who are simply not better off consuming the red pill, whatever the risks that might arise from a lack of its consumption and vice versa. I am simply pointing out that the red pill can and will lead to different outcomes for different men, and that it is not an anodyne to all the ills plaguing a particular man. There is, however, the bigger picture to consider. On the macro level, I remain firmly convinced that the only way forward is one in which each and every obfuscation and deception is removed. Every facet of human nature should be explored and unveiled to its fullest, however offended some might be, however disagreeable the findings are to be found, as long as they are accurate. Sex differences, genetic population differences, psychological quirks, everything. And why? Because despite some progress over the centuries, man's penchant for self-deceit is ultimately what is holding him back. And with that, I wish to turn to something I call the problem of philosophical course correction. I should state at the outset of exploring this topic that by philosophical, I mean rather unconventionally anything that falls under the rubric of lines of thought, ideology, both religious and secular, as well as more traditional philosophy. And it also equally applies to whatever might be scraped together as a result of the accumulation of pure knowledge, i.e. the so-called red pill. Human nature has, for untold millennia, been relatively static. Yes, there have been changes over time in various areas, cognitive, metabolic, and beyond, but the general form and function of the human ape has remained largely the same for several tens of millennia. To the best of our knowledge, we can recognize a beginning to human civilization in the Fertile Crescent, approximately 6,000 years ago, that took the shape of Sumerian culture and society. And since then, there have been countless iterations of more or less the same thing. By more or less the same thing, I am, of course, speaking of relatively constant variables that are always at play in any given society or civilization. Philosophical principles, ideologies, and religions always arise in this human context. They are a byproduct of human nature itself, but additionally represent our best and worst attempts at modifying the human core. An apt analogy might be the following. If you are working on a car, and the engine, tires, and overall structure of the car always remain the same, you can certainly tweak and attempt to improve that car by souping it up in various ways. For example, modifying the engine for somewhat better fuel efficiency, or improving the traction of the already present tires. But what is not happening is a replacement of the engine, or of the tires, of the actual constituent parts of the car, and thus you are, at the end of the day, stuck with the same model of automobile you had at the beginning, with slight improvements, but nothing has been fundamentally altered or changed. It is the same car. In much the same manner, humans attempt to tweak themselves in various ways by applying traditions and lines of thought to themselves, so as to improve themselves, but the net result of this has been failure after failure. With each successive generation, there appear to be ostensible improvements, but also regressions. Take Nietzsche, for example, who recognized that the metaphorical death of God would have lasting and wide-scale implications for the future of European civilization. He thought he had come up with a solution, that of the Übermensch, this man who might rise above normative Christian ideals and ethics to create his own morality, and drive himself to a higher state by way of indulgence in the best of man's artistic creations. The German prefix, über, of course, carries with it implications of transcendence, and thus the Übermensch is the man who transcends himself to become something greater. Nietzsche stated as much in his famous work Also sprach Zarathustra, quote, Der Mensch ist etwas, das überwunden werden soll, end quote. Or in English, man is something that is to be transcended. Noble aspirations indeed, but Nietzsche faced the same issue that we have all faced. Human nature is relatively static, and is not an ever-flexible template that can be transformed by internal thought projected outward through philosophical discourse. Whatever the beauty and poetry of Nietzsche's work and thought, he was, as we are all, forced to work with a very ordinary ape. He failed in his task, just as we all fail, because philosophical course correction does nothing to fundamentally alter the constituent parts of human nature itself. Man remains man, no matter the ideology, be it something profoundly religious, as some pious variant of Christianity might be, deeply philosophical, such as the work of Nietzsche, or even egalitarianism of the current year. Each and every attempt to impose something from without upon within fails, and oftentimes fails spectacularly. The corpses that litter the landscape of the 20th century are a revealing testament to this. MGTOW fails at this too, since the only thing MGTOW offers is knowledge, and a knowledge-based course correction, which in the final analysis is no different in outcome to Nietzsche's philosophical course correction, will necessarily fail, because it cannot affect the actual core of the problem. Why do these sorts of things fail? The answer by now should be fairly obvious. As long as man remains recognizable as man, as the human ape we have been for some 100,000 years, nothing can ever come of purely knowledge-based attempts to alter him. Nor can the noblest philosophy uplift him from the reality of having to squeeze out foul-smelling fecal matter from a rather odd orifice at his rear end. Or in far simpler terms, we are stuck with what we are, and we can at best only slightly modify what we already have, not change it. True change would require both a metaphorical and actual invasive surgery, tinkering with and altering our neurology, our physiology, and innate psychology, sculpting something better, and in doing so, fundamentally changing what it means to be human. And yet, even here, human weakness would likely interfere and prevent optimization. However, one thing is clear. Everything that amounts to mental masturbation and is not invasive as a matter of course correction will not change the core, which demands of itself to be changed in order to overcome natural human limitations. But in our current age, we are doubly crippled in this endeavor. We are sadly caught in a web of our own making, a historical and purgatorial crossroads that seems to stretch forth into the foreseeable future, without remedy or release. What do I mean by this? The strange-eyed French philosopher Sartre, who is best known for his own mental masturbation, namely his own variant of existentialism, wrote the following in the year 1944 in his République du Silence, published in Les Lettres Françaises. Quote, "We were never freer than during the German occupation. We had lost all of our rights, beginning with the right to talk. Every day we were insulted to our faces, and had to take it in silence. Everywhere, on billboards, in the newspapers, on the screen, we encountered the revolting and insipid picture of ourselves that our oppressors wanted us to accept. And because of all of this, we were free. Because the Nazi venom seeped even into our thoughts, every accurate thought was a conquest. Because an all-powerful police tried to force us to hold our tongues. Every word took on the value of a declaration of principles. Because we were hunted down, every one of our gestures had the weight of a solemn commitment. The circumstances, atrocious as they often were, finally made it possible for us to live without pretense or false shame, the hectic and impossible existence that is known as the lot of man." End quote. What did he mean? The fight against an overwhelming force and survival itself became an uplifting and liberating experience far removed from the ennui of the quotidian. The ennoblement of man, in this case, stems from the most basic of instincts, the mere desire to cling to life and live that life, to be able to merely speak words. He hints at exhilaration and exaltation, but the same passage cannot help but remind us of something written and later filmed approximately 5 decades later and acted out by a far less well-known man, Tyler Durden. Quote, "I see all this potential, and I see squandering. God damn it, an entire generation, pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no Great War, no Great Depression. Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars. But we won't. And we're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off." End quote. Many of you might recognize that quote from Fight Club, and it describes the current year just as well as it did the 90s, save that it is even worse in the year 2017. The glorious struggle for survival is not available to us. Instead, we are confined to birth, a life constituted by the endless purchase of shiny things, of vapid, recycled entertainment, of recurrent and uncreative memes, and perhaps the worst of unreflective, regressive politics. And then we drop dead. Tyler Durden could not realize it would be this bad, and what eludes us is perhaps a century hence, or 2, or 3, or perhaps something that shall never come to pass. The opportunity to truly change ourselves, to absolutely change ourselves, to free ourselves from the never-ending rut we have found ourselves in ever since Homo sapiens became a recognizable species. A futuristic world of genetic alteration, fusion of man and machine, pharmacological mastery, and hitherto undreamt of progress, true progress, not shiny new me phones and tablets that merely help us to while away our days on the road to dusty death. Did you know that most of the pharmacological means we use to alter our body's neurochemistry are over 50 years old? Take diazepam, for example, more commonly known as Valium. This drug was launched in 1963. 54 years ago, and little to nothing has changed about it. After all, why interfere with something that seems to work and is cost-effective in production? An external means of changing a facet of the human neurointerface, and it is primitive, and no one is incentivized to improve it. The same could be said for commercial air flight, and a near-endless array of human stagnation. We are content, too content, and we have sated ourselves on our own mediocrity. There is neither glory in our age, nor is there change. We are just the same old stupid apes we've always been, deluding ourselves with every chimerical fiction possible so as to pretend otherwise. And because of this pretense, we will likely be confined to a perpetual cycle of failure, until the whole human experiment implodes in on itself and is replaced by an eternally undocumented silence. And of course, I fully concede that this is my own useless mental masturbation. My words will change absolutely not in you, or your genome, and to the extent that they do affect your neurology, nothing superhuman, nothing übermenschlich will come of it. However, there does exist the exceptionally remote possibility that some among you, upon hearing these words, possess the natively requisite intellect, neurology, and drive to actually change, for the first time in history, what we are. If that happens to be the case, then at least my mental masturbation, scrawled out as block letters upon a screen, will have had some impact. MGTOW will never be enough. Nothing will be enough until we become more than we are and always have been. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.